Tethered Nation, you've often heard me talk about Tethered and their saddle setups and how much I love them, and that I've given them credit for helping me expedite my learning curve or becoming a more mobile and more aggressive hunter, especially whenever it comes to doing out-of-state hunts. Well, their previous saddle setup there's nothing wrong with it. I've used it for 2 years, but they've decided to up their game, if you've not heard, and have released the Phantom saddle. And the things that they've updated this is sizing. Oftentimes, people are asking what size they need to buy based on their waist size. Well, they've kind of eliminated that and created a one size fits most saddle size, which is goes from a 28-inch waist to a 40-inch waist. They developed comfort channels. One of the biggest things people would talk about is just like overall comfort when they get into the saddle. The saddle is comfortable to begin with, but how could they increase that even more? So what they did was they created comfort channels on the loop in which the bridge kind of connects into. And your bridge position will have a lot to do with how comfortable your sit might be, because it's going to determine where the pressure of your saddle is being placed on your body. So if you need a little bit more back pressure, you move it to the higher comfort channel. If you need a little bit more pressure or support underneath your rear end, you move it to a lower comfort channel. The other thing, one of the biggest things I think, overall is, that has to do with comfort is how high you're setting your tether. And a lot of times when you're getting into a tree, depending on the size of the tree, where the branches are, things of that nature, you can't always get your tether height exactly where you want it to be. For me, I like to set mine right about neck height. But if I have a branch that's in the way and I'm hunting public ground and I can't cut it, I might need to set it higher or lower, and that's going to impact the length of my bridge away from me, essentially, or the distance from me to my tether. And the only way I can adjust that is by having an adjustable bridge. And Tether has created the UtiliBridge, which allows you to make that adjustment on the fly, super easy to kind of adjust that length to the optimum position for you to have the most comfort. The other thing that I'm really stoked about that is probably a little bit underlooked is the lineman loops. Now, the lineman loops on the Mantis are fine, but they're not as rigid as the ones on the Phantom saddle are. And the reason why they're a little bit more rigid and bigger on the Phantom saddle is that it's a lot easier to find them whenever you're trying to, ascend or descend in the dark. So for all these reasons, if you've not checked out Tethered, I would go to tetherednation.com, check out their saddle gear, and specifically take a look at the Phantom saddle. The first thing I do in the morning before a hunt, before a scout, or just before getting ready for work is have my morning coffee, and I'm sure most of you out there listening are the same. Make sure you're filling your mug with Skull Brew coffee, as it is the only coffee company that is both 2% for conservation certified and donates 10% of its profits to conservation organizations to help secure the future of our wild places. So head to skullbrewcoffee.com and choose between 3 killer roasts of coffee and know that you are supporting conservation with every sip. Welcome to the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast, brought to you by Skull Brew Coffee Company. I'm your host, Clint Campbell, and you're listening to episode number 176. Today I'm joined by Todd Havel of Mystery River Trackers. We're covering big woods tracking and old school woodsmanship, so stay tuned. All right. Happy Wednesday to you. Hope you're doing well. Hope you are feeling fine. We are grinding through another week of quarantine or something of that nature. It feels like things are not, I don't want to say loosening up. I don't think any of us think that things have loosened up at all. But it seems like certain things are opening up in certain places in Pennsylvania, at least, which maybe hopefully that's a good sign that, we'll get to maybe enjoy some of the things we've enjoyed in the past. Still social distancing. I did see my buddy Wilson a couple. I guess it was last week after I put out last week's podcast. He stopped over. I forget, he was picking something up, and I don't remember exactly what it was. Maybe it was his aerosol. I can't remember exactly why we ended up seeing each other, but we were chatting in the yard for a little bit. And then we ended up FaceTiming, which I don't do a lot of FaceTiming with my buddies. It's kind of weird. I don't like it. I don't mind using Zoom or whatever for work, and doing video conference calls and stuff like that. But when I'm talking to my friends, it's weird to do FaceTime or video chat or whatever, because I never talk to them that way. It's like I'm usually texting. Rarely a phone conversation, once in a while a phone conversation, but mostly text. And so we actually ended up video chatting, but it was kind of cool because we were talking about turkey hunting. We were getting ready for the season opener. And around here, man, Wilson's my go-to kind of turkey guru around here, because I've said this 100 times on the podcast, but I am admittedly one of the worst turkey hunters on the planet. I don't have a lot of patience for it. I just more or less enjoy getting out and being in the timber, carrying a gun or a bow around, and maybe the opportunity presents itself to shoot a turkey in the face. Maybe it doesn't. But I usually end up doing a little bit of deer scouting while I'm out and about. So that's kind of how I approach turkey hunting. But Wilson's all ate up with it. Like Wilson's into it, gets out, roosts birds in multiple places in the off season, so he knows where they're at. And so we were FaceTiming before the opener this past weekend, and we were actually talking. The conversation started because he sent me a text. I think he sent me a text. I either texted him or he sent me something, whatever the case was. We ended up talking about deer hunting, as we always do, and about some scouting that we had done. And usually in the off season, he and I will get together and go scout at least once, maybe twice during the off season and check out some spots together. And then this year we just didn't get a chance to do that. Obvious reasons, things happened where we weren't able to kind of, hang out with one another. So we were texting back and forth about it, and he sent me a picture of a rub, and I was like, oh, you mean this one? And then we had a picture of the same rub, and then I sent him one of a scrape, and he had a picture of the same scrape. So we both were literally scouting the same general area, because we both were like, hey, I've got this hot spot that would be, banging, but it's going to be water access only type of thing. I was like, oh, yeah, me too, and he was talking more or less for turkeys, because he had roosted some birds there, and I was talking more or less for deer. And we may end up hunting it together, some combination of that whenever deer season hits. And so from there, we started showing each other our maps. So I had my map on my phone or on my computer, and I was flipping my phone around showing him, and we started talking through like where he was going to hunt on the opening day of turkey season. And so he was telling me about this little spot that he had roosted some birds that he wasn't going to get to, and said, hey, he's like, if you don't have any plans to be anywhere specifically, which I didn't at that point, I was pretty much, going to figure it out last minute and just go somewhere and, see what happened. Because my plan really was to go back home to the family property and hunt with my father-in-law and Tate, who, you guys kind of know. You've heard me mention him. I did a podcast with him. But I was going to go back and hunt with those guys. But, it's just one of those things where, we could stay socially distanced and stuff like that. But those gentlemen are on, they're older than me. They're in that risk category. And I, of course, live in PA and live in the hot zone of everything that's going on here in Pennsylvania for the most part. So I didn't want to run the risk of going back there and me unknowingly, maybe having something or whatever, and then one of them gets sick. I'd feel terrible. So I just decided not to go back, and I would, stick it solo around here. And so just kind of lucky that Wilson and I were chatting. He's like, yeah, I got a spot. You should check it out. He's like, I know there's a bird in there. He had a camera in there, had a good Tom strutting on camera. And so I was like, sure. And so he told me where the spot was. I'd never been there. It's a little piece, so I figured, easy enough to find my way in. And, so that was the plan, went there Saturday, got in really quiet. It's a really good setup, and everything was really good. I got in nice and early. I wanted to be in early to try to because this piece was small. The kind of thinking was like, if you get there early and you have to park along the road, that if you're the first one there, you're probably going to deter other people from coming in, just because it's such a small piece that one person in there is enough. You have two people on this piece, and it's overhunted. It's a small chunk of this public that kind of sits unconnected to some other public that people may or may not know that it's actually public land. So put it that way. And so I'm sitting there, and, I don't even know what time I got in there. I think I got there. I parked my truck at 4, and I was already at the tree set up at, 4:30. And when I say at the tree, like where I was planning to sit, for the morning at least. And the cool thing was, though, man, like not to divert, but, I found an additional use for my saddle gear, because sorry about the noise there. Got this big beard that's keep hitting my microphone. I was thinking about it because I'd seen, I think, Greg Godfrey do this when he was duck hunting. I think it was Greg. And he actually used his saddle platform, the Predator platform, to sit on while he was duck hunting in this swamp. And so I was like, hey, I was like, I got my pack, and I was going to use my ghillie jacket anyway, and it's rolled up underneath the back of my Predator pack. And so I was like, well, instead of like trying to carry that in and swapping my stuff in my pack and like whatever, everything's already in that pack. I was like, I might as well just carry that in. And if I have the Predator platform, I might as well just, go ahead and, see if I can use it, And so I ended up taking one of those little thermoset pads that I've cut in half that I actually use for my knees whenever I'm saddle hunting. took that and shoved that in the pack as well, and got to my spot, put the Predator around the tree, put my little thermos on it, man, and had a perfect little killer, turkey seat for the morning, and weighed, whatever it is, 3 pounds, and fits in that small pack, and was good to go. So I was sitting there, and I hear like something behind me, and it could have been anything. I was like, maybe it's a deer, maybe it's a possum, like whatever. And I kind of kept hearing it, and I turned around, like at the top. I was sitting down off the edge of this little. I won't even go as far as to call it a ridge, because it's not really a ridge. It's just this little roll or elevation change in this particular area. And I just happened to turn around and look when I heard the noise, and I could see a guy. He was skylit, walking behind me, maybe 20 yards. And so of course, he didn't come from the side where I was parked. He was actually coming from the private that it's connected to. And that was how he was getting in. So I'm assuming he probably lives in one of those adjacent properties. And, right, as it started getting light, maybe 5:30ish or whatever, birds started gobbling. And of course he was beelining like right toward them. And then they gobbled for maybe 20 minutes or so, maybe 30 minutes. And, I'm assuming probably about the time dude got over there is about the time they went quiet. And so that was kind of it for that hunt. And so I ended up pulling my stuff, ended up kind of walking out of there, and went to another piece. It was another small little out of the way piece I had found on the map. No gobbles at all over there. Did a little deer scouting, thought it might be good. It was on the edge of this piece of water that I thought could have been some prime, bedding for a buck. There was this little island that kind of juts out into the water. I thought might be a good little spot. So it was kind of a turkey hunt, kind of a deer scout at the same time. Because I'm not the most patient or persistent turkey hunter. So that was kind of what the deal was for that. And that was really my Saturday, man. Like it wasn't it was I had plenty of work to do when I got home. I guess we'll put it that way. So I think I wrapped everything up probably around like 10 o'clock or so. And here in PA, you can hunt till like noon on the opening day. And so I didn't miss out too much, and it seemed like everything, at least where I was at, and my buddies that I talked to said things kind of got quiet. So I dipped out of the woods, came back, took care of some of my domestic duties, which was good and needed. But the other two pieces of info or that happened this week, I'm getting primed for hunting season, or for deer season rather, is, well, actually three things. One, Iowa preference point purchase. So all folks out there listening, if you want to buy Iowa preference points, it's open now. You can do that. So already making plans for hopefully in 4 more years I'll be back in Iowa. But did get the kayak ordered, so that is happening. That should be here in like the next 2 weeks. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then I'll probably I'll definitely go out and do some trail camera placement once I get that and get those set up in some of those water access areas. And I'll probably do a little YouTube video about that and some of that stuff for, access for trail cameras and stuff like that using water. And then the other piece was, I know I'd mentioned in the last podcast that I may possibly be getting a trailer, a cargo trailer, and was considering converting it for like a mobile DIY hunting rig. And that is confirmed. I just need to go pick it up at this point. It's back home in my hometown, so I just got to find some time to get back there. But it's cool. It's not huge. I got a killer deal on it. So, which is why I picked it up, because it was super, super cheap. But it's a 6x10, and I typically wanted something just a little bit bigger than that. But for my first setup, I think it'll work perfect. It's never going to be more than me and maybe one other guy that's going to use it at a time. So got that trailer, and now I'm really kind of going through the process of figuring out what all I'm going to put in it. I'm not going to get crazy. It's not going to be super fancy. All I really need is a little bit of power. I'm kind of going back and forth on whether I, use a quiet generator or if I get some type of solar setup to use. Solar issue is if I'm using it during hunting season, November, a lot of times there's not a lot of sun. So how much power am I actually going to get? So some things like that to consider. Got to put some, type of bunk beds in there and stuff like that. And, make sure it's rigged up for at least to have like the minimum, amenities, a little bit of heat, electricity to be able to charge some, phones and computers and camera batteries and stuff like that. So it's going to be pretty DIY, but I'm looking forward to it because this is going to really, there's some places here in Pennsylvania that I've wanted to hunt, that I've just not, explore it out, because it's a little bit of a drive from the house. And by the time have to get up and get out there, and, I don't know enough about that property yet at this particular point to make it worth my while to make that effort. But if I had a situation where I could manage to camp close by and not have to make the hour plus drive to get there in the morning before a hunt, I would start to expand my territory a little bit. Now, I've truck camped and stuff like that in the past, but looking for something that's just a little bit more, especially on some of those cold evenings, it's a little bit more conducive for that. So that's kind of what this system is going to be for. My goal is to get it rigged up at least with the essentials by fall. That way I can use it for the Missouri hunt, because I don't know if I mentioned that here, but that is, as of right now, confirmed that I'll be doing some Missouri public land. So I'm stoked on that. And then, of course, my Ohio hunt. So the plan is to get it at least functional and operational for those two hunts before the beginning of November hits. So that's really my whitetail update, man. Got my normal failed turkey hunt, which is pretty par for the course. Kayak is on its way, and a little DIY rut wagon, as I like to call it, that I'll be using this fall, that I'll be converting into some type of livable accommodation. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get jumped into to today's podcast. Got a cool show for you today. This guy I just kind of happened to stumble across. Actually, I'll give my buddy Greg Litzinger the love for kind of connecting me with this guy. One of the things I think I've talked about in the past is just evolving as a deer hunter and trying to get better at all facets. And I know I've mentioned in the past, wanting to be multiple, and I really kind of talk about that in my desire to be able to hunt from the ground better. I think anytime, whatever it is that you do, the more tools you can have in your toolbox, the better off you are, and the more capable you are to take advantage of whatever situations that come up. And so with that, Greg actually texted me one morning before work and said, "Hey, I found this guy. He's got some YouTube videos. He's like, he really knows his stuff. He's like, maybe you should talk to him." And so I ended up looking at his YouTube videos. He has a Facebook page called Misty River Trackers, I think is what it's called. And his name's Todd Havel. And what I really liked about him is he is very much old school woodsmanship, where he's doing a lot of tracking and he's hunting a lot of big woods setups. I've hunted some big woods, whether it was, Ohio or, you could say Iowa, because it wasn't your classic, farmland Iowa type of thing. But what I will say about that big woods setting that I was hunting out there was that there was more structure than you would find in a lot of big woods places, just with like the CRP fields and how things kind of break up a little bit, that you don't get in like big wood settings if you're in, say, Minnesota or upper Michigan or whatever the case is. But where Todd is kind of, I guess earning his stripes, or where he's spent his time, is Wisconsin, Minnesota, and in those kind of big wood settings. And so he relies a lot on tracking and reading sign and stuff like that. Reading sign is something I think as deer hunters we're somewhat, I'll just say familiar with, because I don't want to say knowledgeable about, because we've all kind of have different knowledge levels with that. But we're at least familiar with those things and what we're looking for. Todd kind of takes it a step further, because he's really kind of, as the hunters that we've talked to on here in the past that are just, killers and really good at what they do, he's interpreting it just a level deeper and starting to see things through the deer's eyes. And that's kind of how he's reading the sign. And the other thing that he does really well is tracking it. And he hunts predominantly, I'll say, I don't know that I even asked him this during the show, but just from talking to him, I would say like 98% of his hunting is done by cutting a track and following a deer and tracking a deer. Which to me is really, really impressive, because the nuance and your ability to discern good sign from bad sign, or sign that's worth your time pursuing, is just, the discerning eye that you have to be able to do that kind of stuff and to do it consistently is pretty respectable. And he's killing good deer, getting on good deer, and in a big wood setting. A place without a lot of structure where they can kind of go anywhere. And he's actually getting to the point to where he's able to pattern these deer, like a specific deer. If it's living, he's able to kind of pattern it and find it from one year to the next based on, how he's tracked it in the past, and like what type of cover it's liked, or what type of edge it's like to follow. And, we've talked in the past on this show about yearly trail camera data and yearly patterns. He's finding the same thing with tracking deer. He's finding yearly patterns and tracking deer, which to me just kind of blows my mind, man. You can get that granular with tracking, because it's just a skill that I don't have. But which is why I wanted to bring him on here, because it was something that I know that I need to get better at, is being able to read tracks and interpret them and understand what they're telling me, as well as just sign in general. And he's really adept at those things. So with that, we'll get jumped into the show. As always, want to thank you all for listening. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. And today I have a guest on. So, all of you guys out there that have been following along with me kind of know that one of the things I've been wanting to do this past year is, I've talked about being multiple in my setups and being able to hunt from the ground and stuff like that. And it's one of those things where I was talking with, my buddy Greg Litzinger, and he's always kind of scouring for new information out in the interweb world. And he ran across this fella, and actually sent me a text message. It was like, hey, I ran across this, some YouTube information. He's like, I think you should check it out. He's like, the guy knows what he's talking about. And it was really interesting, because one of the things that I've wanted to get better at, as a hunter, has been kind of more of that old school kind of woodsmanship. Is one thing that I think that a lot of folks lack. And look, I'm going to lump myself into that group, because as passionate as I am about hunting and hunting whitetails, I can always get better with my woodsmanship. So I hopped on this guy's YouTube channel, started checking him out. And the first thing I kind of came onto was him talking about tracking. And that is one area where I lack considerably. So with that, I have on Mr. Todd Havel from Misty River Trackers. What's going on, Todd? How are you? Good. Well, so the one thing, I guess let me back up for a second. Before we dive into, talking about tactics or anything like that, if you wouldn't mind, just give folks out there a little bit of background about yourself, where you're from, what you do for a living, and how you started hunting.
Okay. Well, I grew up in a little town in central Wisconsin, Rudolph, Wisconsin. We had more cows than people. It was a farming community. I was always interested in the outdoors. As a very young child, I was in the outdoors all the time. And coming from a farming background, I guess that's kind of hand in hand with that as well. I looked forward to watching my dad come home from hunting. I would look out the picture window and wait for him to come, more excited than waiting for Santa to come. I wanted to see what he saw that day. I wanted to hear all his hunting stories. Every time he came home from hunting, I couldn't wait to get old enough to actually go hunt. And so it's been in my blood ever since I was a child, I guess. And I grew up in the farm community hunting. And at one point, I kind of wanted a different challenge, so I headed north into the big woods. No fences, no trespassing signs. Very daunting. Anybody that's tried the big woods will attest to that. It'll set you on your heels. Yeah. It's like everywhere you look, there's woods, and how do I hunt this? How do I pick this apart? And
right.
And I did all right. I tried to use a lot of the farm country tactics up in the big woods, and it produced some. But I never really understood the deer. I never understood the deer I was hunting. I never really understood what they were doing, and I kind of got a little bored with it all. And it's like I need something different. So I ran across these guys, Benoits from out east, and it's like, oh, these guys track deer. They follow the tracks and they shoot these deer. It's like, really? Wow. So I started absorbing all their information. It's like, these guys were older and they looked like they were athletes by any means. And I thought, well, I can do that, even though I'm getting up in age, I can do that too,
Right. So
I got really involved, and I started really diving into the tracking, portion of it. And I honestly, I can tell you that, I hunt other ways. I archery hunt when I can have time, and I rifle hunt from stands and so forth. But my true love, my passion is tracking them now.
So it's funny you mentioned those hunting stories with your dad, because I can kind of relate to that, because it was the same. I grew up in Pennsylvania, which is a big hunting heritage state, and I remember my dad going out to hunt and just waiting for him to come back. I mean, talk a little bit about those hunting stories for a second. Like how much of that, like just the allure of listening to the older guys, talk about their experiences, how much of that really kind of, I guess piqued your interest or, made your blood boil with wanting to be able to get out into the timber?
I don't know. My dad never really hunted a lot. It was like he went during rifle. He never talked about deer hunting the rest of the year. He never archery hunted. I think he archery hunted one time in his life when he was younger. And that was the old stick and string way back then.
Right.
So really, it was kind of unusual because my dad was more of a fox trapper. That was his big thing. I learned a lot about trapping from my dad. As far as that goes, my dad wasn't really that big of a hunter. He went and he'd come home and he would tell me what he saw and everything. And I was always excited and I couldn't wait to go. But other than that, once hunting season was done, he put the gun away. He wouldn't mention hunting. My grandpa, on the other hand, was more into the hunting. So I probably learned a little bit more, through him. But again, it wasn't a real big thing. It must have been born in me because I just craved it, and I'm not sure where it came from.
Right. Yeah. No, I totally understand that. I mean, it's one of those things. I think, I don't know. I think as a young kid or a young boy or whatever, growing up, I think we have this natural curiosity for it. I almost think you're right to a degree where it's like kind of born into us, where I think that there's this, I'm going to say caveman, hunter gatherer or a hunter that's kind of in everybody. And I just think all you need is just like a few little experiences at a young age that really kind of makes that come out. And then to me, it's like, it never leaves you, at that point. It's like, once it comes out and you recognize what it is, it's like, at that point, I think you're kind of damned that it's going to be part of you no matter what you do. For some of us, it's a little worse than others. But, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned hunting the big woods, and I've had an opportunity to hunt a couple big woods tracks, probably not the size that you're talking, because I've watched some of your videos in some of the areas, the wilderness areas that you're in and stuff like that. But when you made the transition from kind of like using your farmland tactics to the big woods, like, and I'm sure there's a lot of other guys out there, like me, the first time I went to the big woods and I was, for sure using farmland tactics, and I know I was doing it wrong. Like, what do you think the biggest thing it was that you had to change to be more successful hunting the big woods?
The biggest thing I had to change was I had to understand the animal itself. Mm-hmm. And then once I started to understand the animal, then learning how to hunt them is the easier part then. And that's why it's so difficult, because when you can spend 10 years hunting the Northwoods and you have a few encounters with big bucks in those 10 years, but those encounters are 100 yards and it's over. And so you really, in that 100 yards, you didn't learn any more about that animal than you knew before you saw him.
Right.
And that was the big problem. It was like I absorbed every piece of information that I could find on big woods hunting, and really I wasn't learning anything. And that's kind of why tracking intrigued me, from the standpoint of if I follow it, it made sense to me. If I follow these animals around, they're going to tell me a lot of stuff. I'm going to get to learn about them. And I would say, besides shooting a trophy deer, which is of course everybody's goal, the bigger thing you're going to take away from this is you're going to learn whitetail behavior, trophy deer whitetail behavior in the Northwood setting. Mm-hmm. When you follow 100 of them, you're going to know what they do, how they think, how they act. When I walk into a woods now and I look, I see the woods through the deer's eyes. I don't see it through my eyes anymore. And I can tell you that when I first went up there and now, I look at those woods a whole lot different. I see the way this deer see. I know how the deer are going to move through the land. And the only way you're going to do that is by tracking and following a lot of tracks. And I always equate it to, like, I don't know, the CSI TV shows where they show the crime scene, but then they kind of back up and show the crime happening.
Mm-hmm.
Then they show the evidence laying around and how it, and how it got to be that way. Well, that's kind of what it's like when you're tracking. You start tracking and you see these hoof marks in the snow, and then you see he nibbled on this and he ate that and he went down this hill here instead of going over there. And then you kind of start picturing this deer out in front of you in your mind and watching what he's doing. He's kind of there in front of you then after a while, after you get put in a lot of hours doing it, and you start to see patterns. And one other thing that really made it pop for me as well was when I was done, I tracked all my tracks on GPS, and then when I would go home at the end of the day or back to my camper, I would put it up on my laptop and I would look at it again on big screen, and I could overlay aerials and topo, and I could watch how that deer walked the land. And after a while, you start seeing patterns popping out at you again and again and again on how these deer use the land. So you got that first hand of what they're doing on the ground, and then you can look at these topos and you start to see patterns develop. After you see 1, 10, 50, 100, 1,000, you start to see patterns developing, and that changes your thought process. And then that changes the way you set up on the deer when you're just going out with your rifle and you're going to stand, or your bow and you're going to take a stand.
Right. But I want to ask
now you know where they're going to go.
Right. I want to ask you a couple things. Well, I guess we can kind of encapsulate it in this one question. When I think that's really smart as far as like when you're tracking, being able to kind of overlay the GPS with the topo and stuff like that. Because I mean, people, plenty of hunters out there would kill for that kind of information, because you see these studies that they do, whether it's like Penn State University doing their deer studies and in their collaring deer, and they're able to tell you like their rut movements and time of day that they're moving, and if certain winds or if certain weather patterns are affecting their movement and stuff like that. And I mean, as hunters, like, we can basically take that information and say, okay, well, here's a data set from somewhere that I'm not hunting that's just kind of saying deer behavior in general, right? Which is the 30,000 foot view of what deer are going to do with certain variables in play. What I think is really interesting in what you're doing is you're doing it for the specific area that you're hunting in, and then also on specific deer that you're hunting. Can you tell me a little bit about what type of patterns from some of that GPS data that maybe like sticks out to you in your memory of like, when I saw this pattern emerge, this was like the big aha moment for me?
Yeah, and it's one thing and one thing only. And anybody that's listening to this, go down and get it tattooed on your arm. It's the biggest thing I learned from this, and it's a key to your success in the big woods. If that buck comes through on this trail, when he comes back through, he's going to come back through on that trail. If he comes through on that trail, if he shows up in this area on October 31st, next year he's going to be there on October 31st. They're that patternable. Everybody always says, I hear this again and again and again, all that movement in the big woods is random. There's so much acreage, and they just wander around like transients, and there's no pattern to them. BS. That's the biggest lie that people are telling you, with what they just don't understand. Because they haven't done what I've done. Those deer are so patternable. It's crazy. If he comes down a certain trail, he's going to come down again that same trail if he comes through there. It's gold. If you track a deer, that's why I use the GPS, because if I ever have to go in bare ground and I know a deer is still alive in that area that I've tracked in the past, I know what trails he's going to use. I know where his bedding is. I can set up on those trails near his bedding. And my chances of shooting that deer are slim in the big woods, but they just went way, way, way up over every other guy out there.
Mm-hmm. No,
because I know he's going to use that trail. I can narrow down hundreds of thousands of acres to a few trails.
Yeah. No, that's key. And I think too, I mean, let me ask you this. I mean, I have a couple questions based off of that one. I think we'll take the first one. Do you think that you are getting, let me back up by saying this. I think annual patterns are something that people are more and more beginning to believe in. I know a buddy of mine owns a trail camera company. We hunt a big woods piece together. He's hunted it for, I want to say going on 6-7 years now. I've hunted it, maybe this will be my second year back to that particular piece. And just from, not tracking as you are, but using trail camera data, like we've watched and seen specific deer come back to certain areas within like a 2 to 3 day time frame. And I've encountered the same thing you're talking about, where it's like my first year there, I was like, good Lord, how do you kill anything here? I was like, I can't figure out like where, because they can bed anywhere, they can move anywhere, there's food everywhere. You know what I mean? I was like, it was my first experience. Like you explained it to a T. I was like, but it intrigued me because it was a challenging way to hunt. And it was the idea that you said at the beginning, which was you had to learn to think like the animal and view things like the deer. Right. And that's the part that intrigued me. And so what I started picking up over the past, 2 years was that there are specific deer that we've had on camera at different times of the year, and they're showing up to these places year over year within like a 2 to 3 day window max. Right. And that'll be my opportunity. And so I've kind of started to learn how to hunt it in that scenario. And that is on single deer. My question is, in the big woods setting, do you feel like when you find a particular pattern of a deer that he likes, say there's, in all those thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres, say there's, an acorn, an oak flat, right, that is in this one area that has really good transition cover and all the things you would think a mature buck would look for. Have you seen where not only is that single deer that maybe you are familiar with is using that around that same time frame? Are you also seeing that like deer of the similar caliber or similar maturity continue to use that place in addition to that one deer that you know of?
That's kind of a hard question to answer. I'm going to try to do my best to put words into that. Of course, really good edge trails along a swamp are going to get used by multiple deer. That's why there's a trail there. Mm-hmm. Certain bedding areas are going to get used because they're strategically the best bedding area in that area. Mm-hmm. Food sources, again, are the best food source in the area, so multiple deer are going to hit them. So the answer to your question is kind of yes, but then I'm going to also turn around and I'm going to say absolutely no, because what I see is every big buck. Now, I'm not talking about smaller, younger deer or does or whatever, but every big buck develops his own patterns, his own system. And when he's gone, you'll know it if you're in touch with that woods, because his system will dry up. He won't show up in that area anymore. That trail won't have rubs on it like it used to have. That bedding area, that one spot that he, and when I say bedding area, that one little hump in the tamarack swamp that he used to lay on won't be bedded anymore. Right. And so they are so individual.
Right.
It's crazy how individual, but they will all go and eat the right food sources when they're in. Right. They'll all use the same edge trails, those kind of things. But as far as the individual pattern on each buck, you can't expect another buck to replace that buck and then use his pattern.
Right.
It's just not going to happen.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. And I think sometimes we see, maybe in like, we'll just say farm country, because I know you mentioned it at the beginning, where you might see I guess I'll put it this way. It's not uncommon if you have a mature deer that gets killed, on a farm or whatever, that is using the best bedding, right? That the next year, the next best mature deer takes his place. I think that happens in farm country settings because you're dealing with chunked up parcels with a fair amount of pressure around that only provides so many places that a mature buck is willing to bed in, right? And I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'm asking for confirmation here. It feels like in the big woods that area will dry up because it is so vast that there are ample opportunities for mature bucks to find what they're looking for. And because of the vastness of the area, they just aren't experiencing the pressure that is forcing them to make a bedding choice out of pressure versus preference. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, well, like I said, they've got their own. They each have their own individual personality, and that shows through in the choices that they make, and which brings up another point with these big woods deer. If you're not a mobile hunter, you're not gonna win the game year after year. You can't win the game year after year because, again, you take that big buck out of that area that you're hunting, that square mile that you're hunting. There may not be a replacement in there. And now you love that area and you had success there, and in your brain you're remembering that tool that you made, so you keep going back to that stand. And I see guys do this for 10 years.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I go back 1 year and I don't see that buck there anymore. I move on. I mean, I'm like a wolf. I cover ground and I find where these deer are. And if they're not there the next year, I'll determine that in a hurry, especially if there's snow on the ground. I'll go to their favorite crossings and I'll go there 2 or 3 days in a row. And if they haven't come across in 2 or 3 days in all the crossings that I know that they use, I know they're dead.
Right.
And I move on. There's no sense of me, they're just not going to be there anymore. And they hold them patterns so true that if he's still alive, he's going to be coming across. If you come to my tracking school, I've got an example. I show mappage and everything of it. It's a really good example of this. One deer would cross a road in one spot. I never saw another deer track besides that deer's track. And he was a brute. And he was a monster. And I was after him for 3 years. And every time he crossed that road in that one spot, I could have dropped a hula hoop on the ground a half a mile away, and I know that his track would have been in that hula hoop. That's how tight of a pattern he was running. And when I say I dropped that hula hoop, there was a creek crossing that he absolutely used every time he came through there. Every time he crossed the road there, he had a pattern that he snaked along the edge of the swamp, followed this edge all the way, went way down the creek, and when he found that crossing, he would turn and he'd go right across that crossing every time I took him. So that's how patternable they are. That's just one example of hundreds like that. They hold those patterns, and again, it's hard to put words on this stuff and explain it for people to understand. They're not on a track. They're not like on a trolley system where they can't veer off.
Right.
This buck will go. You have to think. That's another thing too. So much to try to cover.
Yeah.
You have to think really huge in the big woods. You can't think 40-acre plots. You can't think this little oak ridge or this little swamp. That's such a small part of their daily life or whatever, especially during the rut, that it just doesn't work. You have to think really big. You have to think of a doe group that's a mile and a half away, and you have to think about how he's going to go from this doe group to that group a mile and a half away. What's the best way for him to get there? Right. I mean, you have to start thinking mile and a half. You have to start thinking 4 miles. I've chased deer up to 6 miles. Wow. Without them ever even stopping to take a poop or to eat or lay down.
Wow. Yeah.
And so you have to think really big. You have to think really, really large terms as far as these deer, how they use this land. Now I'm talking rut. When it's not rut, they tighten their home court down quite a bit. Right. But during the rut, you have to think really big puzzle. You have to, people send me maps and they ask me, hey, what do you think of my hunting area? And I send them back and I say, I don't think much of it at all because I can't see 2 miles away. Right. You have to give me GPS coordinates right, so that I can look what's 2 miles away. A lot of times it's common sense. Connect the dots between the clear cuts. Right. That's where they always end up. You would believe sometimes I get on these tracks and I go for miles and miles and miles, and all of a sudden I pop out on a clear cut and I think, holy shit, how far did I go? This clear cut is miles and miles and miles away. By road, it might be 15 miles away, but straight through the woods, it was only 4 miles. Right. So that's how you have to think about this.
Right. I was just going to say, I think you made 2 really good points, or one really good point, and then something that I've experienced, which is, having to think big. And I think that was the biggest kind of learning curve for me, and still is, as I'm, adapting to that bigger woods setting to hunt in is just the size of it, right? And you're 100% right, where it's like my buddy Chad and I, we would talk about it, and just about their long lines of movement, right? Because you're used to, if you're hunting, even if you're hunting public land and you're hunting parcels that are maybe 1,500 acres or 3,000 acres, I mean, that still isn't huge, because you can look at it and go, all right, well, this is where they won't be spending time based on hunting pressure, right? This is the area. I mean, you can quickly take 3,000 acres and get it down to 500, where it's like, that's really where the deer are probably going to be, right? And then that's kind of easier to wrap your brain around. When you're in some of these places, like the place I'll be hunting again this year, it's probably not the same size of what you have in the Northwoods, but it's close to 70,000 acres, which is pretty big. And just thinking about, and it's not ag country, like there's no farms around. It's all just big mountains and nasty clear cuts and deep ravines, and having to think about how a deer is going to move from place to place and how far away those things are. Like the way we typically hunt, I think, just doesn't condition you to think that broadly, and so I think that's a really good point, because that deer, where you might say, oh, he might be bedded over here. It's like, well, he may be going the opposite direction when he gets up from bed to go check a doe bedding area that could be 2 miles away. So he's never going to make it to where you're at until tomorrow morning or whatever the case is. You know what I mean? Or he might not get there for 2 days.
Right. He might be gone. He might be gone on one of his rut. I call them rut cycles or circuits. He might be on one of those. He might find a doe and eat. He might hook up with her for 2 days. And if you're hunting his home core, he might not be back there for 2 or 3 days, and he might find a doe and heat on the way back and never get back for 4 days.
Right. Yeah.
And that's another mistake I see big woods hunters make. Actually, everybody, a lot of these guys, they use the term rutification or whatever. They take their vacation during the rut. Take that center of the peak of the rut right out of your rut vacation and throw it in the garbage. Don't even bother to go in the woods during the peak of the rut. Don't even bother. You got to hit them before the does get in the heat, or you got to hit them after most of the does have been bred. Because what's going to happen in the middle is all the big mature bucks are going to be locked up on does. And usually they find them at night, and then they hang with those does until they've bred them for a couple of days, and then they move on. And most of the time, they're already settled in with the next doe during the peak of the rut before the light of day again. And so are you going to get a buck to move during the light of day sometimes? Yes, you do. You will. But honestly, it's like winning the lottery. You hear this. How many times have you heard the statement, all the little bucks are circling, all the little, the big ones aren't moving yet? I've heard that again. The big ones aren't moving yet. Bull. They're not. They are moving. But they're moving at night, and they're locking up with does.
Yep.
And that's why you're not seeing them move. Now, if you are that one guy in a million that's lucky enough to be right where there's a doe in heat, she might be dragging around 3 really nice bucks, and then you'll have the hunt that you'll never forget the rest of your life. It might be the last hunt you ever have like that your whole life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think people overstate or overplay rut activity, because I think for me, I personally have only ever experienced that kind of like crazy rut activity, where it was like what you're saying, where it's like I had a day where it's like I just saw buck after buck after buck, and I just happened to be, well, not happened to be, I knew where I was at, but I was set up in between 2 doe bedding areas that basically was connected by a scrape line, and they would travel this basically this saddle between these 2 ridges all day, back and forth. It was a hot morning spot. It was a great midday spot. By the evening, it started it would cool down. And I had 3 days of that one year, and it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. And that spot is typically a decent place, but I've never seen it like that again.
Yeah, well, and I've had it too. I mean, my most memorable rut hunt was one where I pushed the barrel out into the chest of the buck, squeezed the trigger, and drove out of the way before he ran me over. And that was, I think that was the 4th buck through.
Wow. Yeah.
The other ones all passed within 4 or 5 feet.
Right.
I mean, and you get it. That happens sometimes, but like I said, if you're banking on that happening, that's really low odds. And
Right.
so I would rather be out there now. Back it up to what you were talking about. You're throwing cameras out in your areas, and you're starting to learn some pattern movements and so forth. Rub lines tell you historical patterns. Those are really good to go by. Get on those early. Where I used to go, where I still go actually, up in northern Wisconsin. I used to be able to get up there earlier and bow hunt. Now in my business, I don't have time to get up there and do that anymore. But I noticed the pattern year after year. Every year, the 26th or 27th of October, all the scrapes opened up. Mm-hmm. Every year, to the day, 26th, 27th. And so if you would have asked me when was my best chance of shooting a trophy buck up there, I would say the 26th or 27th. I would say plan to be up there the 24th, 25th, and then start sitting all day long on these rub lines.
So let me ask you a question about rubs, because that was actually one of the things I wanted to get to. And then I do want to circle back to tracking, because that's something I definitely want to hear more about. But, I guess let me ask this way. Have you found any specific kind of patterns or anything that you found to be, a tip or a tip off when it comes to rubs, specifically as it relates to rubs that are around, beds or around bedding in general? Is there anything to that, like, clusters of rubs? Do you see that? Do you find them more around primary bedding? Like, just give me your take on rubs and how it relates to bedding.
Rubs are really interesting thing, because most of the time, guys are hunting the rubs all wrong. And for the most part, hunting a rub is almost stupid. What I see by tracking these deer is a lot of these rubs are made frustration, aggression, just testosterone. Most of the time it's because they come across another buck that had crossed right where they are, and they get excited. They'll every time they cross another buck's track, they'll pee. Mm-hmm. And if they get worked up a little bit, they'll paw the ground. You see a lot of these little basketball-sized scrapes opening up. A lot of times those are one-time deals made in those situations. And rubs are the same. They'll get worked up that there was another buck in their area, and they'll rub something up. I see a lot of these bigger ones along these transition lines, along like where the does are feeding, really good, heavily used transition lines where does maybe are bedding, between the hardwoods and the swamps or something. You see these big rubs, and the guys get excited, and they want to throw up a stand, and they want to hunt that. The only problem is the buck that made that rub there, that really big monster, maybe 4, 5, 6 inch tree or whatever, maybe an 8-inch tree. He probably made that in the middle of the night, and he was probably 3 miles from his core area.
Right.
And know that rub makes you take a picture of it like I do when you share them on the internet, when you see one of those, and everything. It's really cool and everything, but it's the last place I want to hunt. I mean, it's just not it's not a high percentage spot. Mm-hmm. When you see clusters of rubs near a bed, mm-hmm. bingo. I mean, that's a very good place to hunt. If you see clusters of rubs or a lot of rubs near where there's doe bedding, that's telling you that those bucks are coming through, and they're getting a little excited, and they're rubbing up, right near that doe bedding because they smell those does. Mm-hmm. That could be a really hot spot during the rut, because that's where he comes through there. That's where he's traveling. One thing rubs do tell you is they tell you that they can tell you that there's a big buck in the area. Mm-hmm. They can kind of tell you how many bucks are. I think the more competition, the more rut activity you see, including rubs. Mm-hmm. And then you can start to look at rubs as rubs are like a fingerprint. That one particular buck, he's got a big spur on his base, and every time he rubs a tree, he rips the tree up real hard. Okay. Mm-hmm. And he always wants to go after white pines, and he always rubs them that are about 3 inches in diameter, and the height on his rubs are almost always the same. His rub is like a fingerprint. You can walk a mile away and find another tree, and you can say, "Hey, I know that buck."
Right.
And then the next rub you see, is on a maple tree, and he's always hitting maple trees, and it's smooth as butter. There's no scarring anywhere. He's rubbing the bark right off, but it's smooth as butter because he doesn't have any burrs on his bases or nothing. He's not getting his tines and his brow tines involved when he's rubbing. He's hooking in that crotch probably between his brow tine and his his main beam, and he's rubbing smooth. And then you remember that. Now you get a quarter mile away along some edge, and you see that same rub, and now that same buck. That's part of his travel pattern.
Right.
And so rubs are really a good indication of what's around and in where their travel patterns are.
Right.
And if you're going to be more than just a tracker and you're going to start bow hunting an area and rifle hunting an area and you're trying to learn individual buck patterns, those are the things you want to start noting on your GPS. And Onyx, I love their setup because you can take pictures as a waypoint. And I'm doing that a lot now. I take pictures of rubs. I take pictures of a lot of things. If I'm going to pick out a tree that I want to hunt out, I take a picture of that tree because that way when I go back, I can remember what tree it was that I wanted to hunt out of. I don't have to really think about it a lot again.
Right.
But getting back to the rubs, if I take a picture of that rub and then I'm still scouting that area and I get 3/4 of a mile away and I see another tree rubbed up, I can open up my Onyx and look at that picture of that rub, and usually you can tell. You can usually say, "Oh yeah, that is that buck," or "No, that one looks different."
Right. I think that's really handy, especially in the big woods where it's like you have I'm going to assume like the deer density is probably lower. At least in the big woods section that I hunt, like the deer density is pretty low, or deer per square mile. And so you could probably say with relative confidence too, it's like, unless the rub is completely like different, just I'm judging like from a picture, right? Like you can probably say with pretty good confidence that's the same deer as long as it has very, very similar characteristics, right?
When you start studying them, you're going to start seeing that more and more. You're going to start to really say, yeah, I'm almost certain that this buck is the same buck. You start to really study them, really take a close look at them. That's things that I never did either in the past, and I've gotten very good at doing that. Like deer tracks. I looked at tracks all my life, and when I started tracking deer for the first time in my life, I really looked at a deer track. Really studied a deer track. Now I'm doing that with rubs. I look at rubs and I really study the rub. Because I want to be able to know, if that's the same deer that's in this area.
Right. And I was watching one of your videos there a week or two ago or whatever it was, and if I'm not mistaken, I think you were talking about being able to tell the maturity of a deer that made them. Can you talk a little bit about how you kind of evaluate them to tell you, what maturity level that deer might have been that made that rub?
Yeah, I think there's a lot has to do with the bigger the buck, the bigger the tree they'll pick on. Not always the case, but that's a really good way of looking at it. And I've noticed this, but I'm going to give credit to Dan Infault on this one because after he mentioned it, I started looking at it a little bit closer, and I agree with him. The higher the rub is, the older, the bigger the buck.
Right.
I don't know why they do that. I think it's because they're just bigger and stronger. But it seems to be. I think he's right with that. I think he's 100% correct. I think the higher up the average of the rub is. But you'll see this too. I talked about how smooth or how scarred it is, but you'll get some bucks too that their rub will only be like maybe 13 inches, 15 inches wide. And then you'll get another buck that he'll want to scar that tree up and down for 2 feet, so that even the length of the rub up and down. Another thing too, that I learned from tracking, I'm sitting here talking to you about this, and I've got a 140 class 8-pointer that I tracked right on the wall right next to me here.
Nice.
I've got pictures of the rubs he made before I killed him. It was whippy brush, less than a ½ inch in diameter. And he worked it all up, and it was all, busted up and rubbed up and everything. So I would say a big rub can tell you that there's most likely a big deer, but don't discount the little rubs as being little. They could be, but they might not be. I've seen a lot of big bucks tear up a lot of little stuff. So that would be, I guess, if I had to say, I would say if it's really big, there's a really good chance it's a big buck. If it's small, you really don't know for sure.
Right. I think that's funny you mentioned that because one of the spots this year that I was doing some scouting this off season on a piece I'd never been to before, and came across this kind of primary scrape area that had a handful of rubs in it. And there was one kind of what you're talking about where it was like a smaller kind of bushy, brushy kind of, I don't even know what species it was, tree thing. That's kind of what I referred to it. But it was like every stinking like trunk on that thing was rubbed, and anything that was about as big around as my thumb, maybe just a little bit bigger, was snapped off. And that was probably, I was just going to say that was the spot that I was probably most excited about, because I was like, man, that takes some strength to break something like that. The fact that everything was rubbed up and he was snapping stuff off that had some decent size to it, I was like, all right. I was like, I think that I have a place where there could be a decent deer.
Right. Try it once. Go out in the woods. That's why I wanted to interrupt you. Try to break that yourself.
Right.
Try to do that and find out just how hard it is to break that green stuff off. That's a half-inch diameter. It's really hard. So they've got to be very powerful to break that off the way they do. So that tells you that's got to be a substantial deer. And matter of fact, if it's twisting brush off, you know it's a tine buck, because a spike can't wrap.
Yep, exactly. Well, the other thing was too. The other thing was too is this was on a top of a mountain, and it was a weird. I refer to them as mountaintop swamps, because I get up on top of this couple areas, and it gets all swampy where it gets kind of indented on the top. And where there was actually cattails up there, and there were cattails that were being drug away from where the cattails were at. And, obviously, a spike can't get cattails wrapped around their antlers and move them 50 yards away. So that was those were the couple pieces that I put together in that spot where I was like, all right, I think we got, my buddy Greg was with me, and he's the one who pointed out the cattails or the reeds being drug away, because he hunts a lot of swamp, and I don't, or I hunt swamp where I'm usually at. There's not as many reeds. And that's something that he's always noticed was, more mature deer with a better rack will get that junk wrapped around their antlers and end up carrying it away. So if you're finding, reeds and swamp grass, 50 to 100 yards away from where the reeds and swamp grass are, good chance that was a buck that got it wrapped in his tines and ended up dropping it there.
Yeah. And one thing I want to mention too, as long as we were talking about rubs, there is one rub that I pay an awful lot of attention to, and when I find one, I'm really excited. And it seems like it's getting harder and harder to find them anymore. But a signpost rub, if you know what a signpost rub, if you can find one of those are worth hunting. I know that I was reading Hal Blood, the tracker from out east.
Yep.
He found a really good one, and I know he pays a lot of attention to him, and he put a client on it. The client hunted it for about a week or so, I don't know, quite a few days, and he didn't have success. And that client rotated through camp, and the next client came in, and he told the other client about that as well. And he says, this is something that, we might want to spend some time on or whatever. And the guy decided he wanted to hunt it. He shot the biggest buck that Hal has ever taken in a camp. It was like a 180 class off that signpost. And the reason that signposts are so good, there's a bunch of reasons. One is because there's a lot of different deer using it, so that when you're sitting on it, you're not hoping for one, you're hoping for, maybe multiple different deer could come through, which puts your odds up. Mm-hmm. And signpost rubs are always going to be in a hub situation. It's always going to be where edges converge with other edges and kind of funnel deer movement to that spot. And that's why that signpost rub is there, because so many deer are passing through that area. Mm-hmm. So that signpost rub tells you that that's a hub of activity there.
Right.
So, and that would be, your odds start going up when you start hunting that. So, again, it's everything in the big woods is low odds. So you're trying to go from 1 in a million to 1 in 100,000,
Right. Yeah. No.
So, and the thing that's almost kind of, the only thing I don't like about tracking is, now that I've tracked, I know just how crappy your odds really are. It's good now, because now I know the truth. Now I know that if I'm out in the woods and I'm sitting, the chances of me scoring are so low that I almost can't force myself to sit anymore.
Sure. All right, folks, we're back. Sorry about that. We had a little technical difficulty with my internet, but we got Todd back on the line here. So now, Todd, I want to transition now and start talking about tracking. And one of the things it's one of the things, like I said at the top, that I'm trying to get better at is reading tracks. But I don't trust myself yet at this point to be able to know that I'm either looking at a buck track or a doe track, unless like the size is just so obvious that it tells me. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you're deciphering between a doe track and a buck track? Like, what are those things you're looking for?
Sure. First of all, you hit the key point. I very seldom don't bother with any track besides one that's really, really big, because then I absolutely know for certain that it's a good buck, that no doe will get that big. And then I also know, if it is a buck, it's an awful big one. And I know that when it gets messed up with other tracks, I can find it a lot easier. So there's a lot of advantages with picking the biggest track in an area. But other than that, if you're going to pick a track and you're going to take it, the main thing to do is a bunch of things. Let me kind of run them down for you. When I evaluate a track, I evaluate the smallest track in a set. I'll walk, sometimes a quarter mile before I'll decide to take that deer. And I'm looking at the smallest track, because when a deer walks, they walk hind leg in front, hind hoof hits the front hoof hole. So you're actually seeing a double print every time, unless they step off to the side. And so every deer is different, and a lot of deer have just a little stagger difference, and sometimes they always punch a little bit bigger hole because of that, because the other one doesn't perfectly line up, and that's just the way their gait is or whatever. And so they make their own track look bigger. So I look at a series of tracks to evaluate over a distance of time or a length of time, and see get a better picture of what he really is. If you have that opportunity, if you got good snow conditions and stuff, and you can do that, because you're going to be putting a lot of effort into taking that track. It's going to be the rest of the day, and you're going to come out of the woods absolutely exhausted and beat to hell. So you don't want to take anything but what you really want to have. You really want to take a good track. So evaluate first. I always kid and liken it to getting married. Really evaluate close before you make your decision. So because you're gonna be stuck with it for a while.
It's a commitment.
I mean, make sure that you're happy with it. Make sure it's really what you want, and you'll save yourself a lot of wear and tear. I'll tell you that. But then when you're looking at a track, bucks walk a certain way, and when I say that, it's in the rut. When there's snow on the ground in my area, it's always the rut. I don't care if it's halfway through December, it's still the rut. Bucks move over long distances. They don't meander around or goof around. They're on the move. So when you're looking at the track, you got to read the entire track, not just hoof prints. So you're looking for a big track, and then you're looking for a big track that's cutting country. Okay. One that's not goofing around or milling around. Of course, a lone track. It could be with a doe, so you got to make sure that you're evaluating that right too. That it ain't a doe fawn, that it's a buck doe.
Right.
And that can get a little tricky, because sometimes these young does fawn does can come into heat, and they have an awful tiny track, and then it kind of fools you. Well, it's like a big doe with a fawn, but no, that's a buck chasing her.
Right.
But evaluate the track over a distance of time and see what this deer is doing. And then if they stop and pee, the does pee different than the bucks. So that'll tell you right away. If they stop and pee, you should be able to tell the difference between if the doe is squatting or a buck.
All right. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, what do you look for? What's the difference?
Well, a buck his penis is in the, like on his belly, and the doe, she pees out the back. So, I mean, just look where the hoof prints are laying.
Okay. So it's the urine patch in relationship to the hoof prints.
Yeah, she'll bunch up her feet. She'll bunch up her feet kind of together, and then she'll pee out the back. Okay, yep. So your urine stain will be back behind the tracks. Whereas a buck, a lot of times he'll even try to pee on his hocks or whatever, but his penis is forward of the hind legs. So that look for that. A buck will always pee when he crosses another buck track. So if you see a buck cross a buck track and then you see you dribble a pee there, you'll know it's a buck. A doe won't do that.
Got it.
Again, a big track is one you want to take, and you'll know for sure. If he stops and rubs or makes a scrape, it's a buck.
Right.
So, there's a lot of different indications. If he beds down, look for the tarsal staining in the bed. They'll always be there.
Mm-hmm.
A doe bed won't be like that. A buck bed will. And then as long as I mention that, scoop, either get right down on your hands and knees and stick your face right down in there, or scoop the snow up and smell it. And you'll smell that tarsal smell, which is horrible. And you can tell how old that bed is by how strong that tarsal gland smells, and the pee as well. When you come across a deer and you're tracking them, scoop it up in your hand, smell it. After a while, your nose will start telling you how old that track is. Is it 8 hours? Is it 4 hours? Is it 2 hours? Believe it or not, your nose is good enough to be able to tell you that after a while. After you smell enough of it, you'll be able to smell urine and say, wow, that's really strong, or wow, that's getting old already.
Right.
So those are all indications as to what you want to look for. I'll tell you, the biggest indication I use, people talk about stagger from left to right. I've heard it talk that a linebacker or a lineman in football has got a really wide stance, so a big buck will have a wide stance as well. Mm-hmm. But I've just not found that to be true. Maybe it is in other areas of the country, but the areas I've chased deer in, I've not found that to be true. And stride length. I don't care too much about the length of his stride either, because that changes with him getting tired or if he's fresh. And it also could be that it could be a little bit smaller framed buck. I don't care if the buck is a smaller framed buck. If he's a 4 or 5 years old and he's carrying a rack with 40 inches of mass and he's a solid 8-pointer, I don't care if he's 6 inches shorter than the other deer.
Right.
Yep. So I don't care about the stride length. Kind of try to cover so much here at once.
Yeah. Let me ask you another quick question about the track, because totally makes sense, looking for the size of the track, making sure, it's in comparison, you want to kind of look for the smallest track that's in the kind of group as well, because they'll step into their front hoof track and stuff like that. Like, that all makes sense. If I'm going to ask for like the dummy guide for the guy, let's say if you were writing the book of tracking for dummies for me specifically, is there kind of a rule of thumb that you use, for like the track size for, like, just say like a guy like me who's going out into the woods and he's just starting to learn, or starting to pay more attention to tracks, and, and say I find a track, am I looking for, something that's 4 fingers wide or 3 fingers wide is going to be a buck? And now this is all dependent on like the area that you live and how big the deer potentially are in your area, of the country. But it's like, do you have a rule of thumb that you could say, hey, if it's a 4-finger track, like, you're probably in pretty good business that it's a buck, and you probably want to investigate it a little further, taking into consideration that, whether it's on soft ground, in mud, or whatever the case is?
Yeah. You got a lot there.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. That's fine. The first thing, you hit on it, and so I got to answer your question with a question. How big of a buck track am I hunting? Northern Minnesota, or am I hunting northern Wisconsin, or am I hunting the UP, or am I hunting up in Ontario? Because every one of those areas has a different size track that I will take.
Right. No,
and
exactly.
So my answer to your question is you have to learn the deer in your area and what a big track is in your area, and then that's what you want to aim for. When I'm in northern Minnesota, I see tracks that are scary huge, and it's unbelievable. If I waited for one of those in central and northern Wisconsin or up in the UP, I would never track another deer.
Right.
Because they just don't have the feet. Matter of fact, it goes in this order. Minnesota's got the biggest, central or northern Wisconsin's got second biggest, and you get up into UP, for some reason they got tiny feet. I don't know why.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know why that is, but I've noticed that to be the case, and so it gets harder when you get into those areas like in the UP. And that's just maybe the area of the UP that I hunt. There might be, I mean, UP is a pretty big area, so
right.
There may be areas where that isn't true. But I guess the answer to that question is you have to go out there and you have to put your time in and learn and look at hundreds, thousands of tracks and then determine what a big track is. If you're questioning that, break a stick off and put it in your pocket, or use a shell casing as a guide, or use some sort of measuring device. I hate to use the term 2, 3 finger, 4 finger, because I've got tiny fingers, and I know
right.
guys. I've got a ring here that I can almost pass a $50 through that I got from an estate one time, and so if I use 3 of his fingers, I would never find a track that big. Use something as a guide. Use a stick or use I always use my 30-06 shell to kind of give me an idea.
That's something that has a frame of reference that's consistent, right? That's
right. And for that area, look and see what's available in that area, what you're seeing consistently for, what's the biggest that area can provide, and then, and then what you're willing to go on. The idea is the bigger the track you can take, the easier it is to stay with that track, because it's going to get muddled up with other tracks. And it's so much easier if you can move quicker and stay with that track easier, without doing a lot of looking.
Right. All right.
One thing I wanted to cover too, we were talking about tracks, and we didn't touch on this at all, and this is very important. So I want to interrupt you and mention this.
Yeah.
Dewclaws. That's my number one determination. When a buck's dewclaws are laying as wide as the track, a non-running track now, when they're walking, if that dewclaws are laying as wide as the track or even a bit wider, he's a good one.
Yeah. Okay.
He's a good one.
That's
my number one. And if you've got shorter, if you got really shallow snow, I love to see a buck hitting dews when there's hardly any snow at all, like where they cross the road, when it's already been pushed down by the cars or whatever, and he's still touching his dews when he's crossing that road. It's like, wow, that's nice, because they're laying way back then, and that tells me they got some weight.
Right. So what about if you're in an area like, say, where I'm at in Pennsylvania, and like this year we didn't really get any snow, like to hunt. I think I hunted one day where there was actually snow on the ground. Or scout for that matter. Like, how do you go about, do you apply the same kind of approach and thinking, whether if you get like some soft ground and like maybe a little bit of mud, you know what I mean? Stuff like that. Do you apply the same thinking, or does your kind of thinking change whenever you're looking at it, not in snow?
The track itself?
Yeah.
It's very important to know the medium that it's in, and it's also important to know the consistency of the medium when he made the track, not when you're looking at it.
That's a good point.
I see guys that show so many times. I see these pictures on the internet of these guys taking pictures of deer that cross fields that were muddy, and this track is sunk in there 4 inches, and this track is wide, and it's splayed out, and this track looks monstrous. But and then they're standing next to it, and they're not sinking in at all. Well, I don't know how the soil is where that track was made, but I grew up in clay country. Clay country, when the clay gets wet, that track will sink right in. Matter of fact, I used to grow cucumbers. I used to lose my boots in the mud. It would get so bad. 2 days later, it was like walking on pavement.
Right.
So being able to analyze those things are really critical. When you have a splayed track, and that means, when I'm saying splayed, is the toes, the tips are really wide compared to the back.
Mm-hmm.
That's a splayed track. They splay like that when they're running, or when they spread their toes out like that. That track will look so much more bigger than that deer really is. That track will lie.
Right.
That'll make them look so much bigger. And I see that a lot of times too. When your track is making a V, I got a little video. If you go to YouTube, I got a little video on that. I showed some pictures, and I kind of did a drawing on there really quick. It's a couple minute tutorial only. a track that's more block shaped, like a rectangle. If you draw a rectangle around the track itself and the Dewclaws, it'll make a rectangle. If it's more like an hourglass, if it's like a V shape, that toes are splayed, that's not a good track to use as an indication. That doesn't mean he's not a big buck. That means look at more of the tracks to make a better evaluation.
Right. Yeah, I actually watched that video and it totally made sense. I was like, I just never thought of that before. And then once I watched it, I was like, I was like, there you go. I was like, easy way to kind of quickly tell what I'm looking at, you know?
Yeah. And then, and then the old adage about the big buck with the rounded toes or whatever, it depends on the medium they're living in. If they're in rocky, hilly soil or whatever, where their toes they're using their toes to climb a lot, and for traction, they're going to wear them down. It's like our fingernails.
Right.
You take somebody that's working in cement or something all day, their fingernails are always wore down. But you take somebody that's working in an office, they got long fingernails because they don't wear them down. And that's all a hoof is a fingernail.
Right.
So if you get a buck in muddy country, and I've looked at when people have a buck hanging, I go over there. I don't run over there and look at the rack. I go over there and look at their feet. Right. I want to see their feet. And I've seen a lot of 4 or 5 year olds, like up in the up in the Wisconsin area that I hunt because it's so swampy there. A lot of 4 or 5, 6 year old bucks that have really sharp toes yet.
Right. No, that's a good point. I never thought of that. Just based on like the area that they live in, what their track, and whether it would be rounded or not rounded, and what that might mean as far as like age, size, or sex.
Right. And and tracking, the best way to learn is look at so many tracks that your eyes start crossing.
Right.
I can't even tell you. I have no idea. I look at 100,000 tracks already. I don't know.
Right.
I've been doing this for about 12, 13 years or so now. I do a lot of driving and looking for tracks. And I have no idea how many tracks I've looked at in my life. It's like scary, the number I've looked at. And you start to see subtle things in tracks. I've made this comment before, and it is kind of funny. We watch the old westerns where the old Indian would be tracking, and he would tell the cowboy, this white man weighed 180 pounds, and he was carrying his rifle in his left hand, and his right knee was sore. And you laugh at that, like you're laughing right now. It's like, right. Yeah, right. But when you look at enough tracks, honest to God, you reach a point where you start to see that stuff. It's kind of weird.
Right. No, I totally get it. It makes sense. I mean, you start to get really good at picking up the nuance of things. And as we know, especially with hunting whitetails, like the devil's in the details, and it's in the nuance. And the better you are at picking out those things, whether it's patterns or tracks or whatever it is, when you can start to pick out the smaller details, that's when you, at least for me, that's when you really start to see, more encounters, and better kill opportunities, But speaking of nuance in that kind of detail, like one of the videos that you had that I watched, I thought was really interesting, and I never thought of it. And it was one of those things where once you said it, it made all the sense in the world. And I was like, I can't believe I've never thought of this before, but it was related to a track. But, you were talking about the importance of some of the things that present around the track, outside of the track, that are critical in helping you decipher, what the track is telling you. Like, for example, like whether it goes around or through terrain, whether it goes underneath something or around it. Like, can you talk a little bit about some of those subtleties that are out around the track that help you kind of decipher, what the track ultimately is telling you, the caliber of deer, the male, female, et cetera?
Sure. The biggest thing that I'll focus on, is when you find a really good buck, when you find a big old buck, one that's probably minimum of 5 years old, but probably older than that yet, 6, 7 years old. They all have that one same characteristic. After you follow them for a little while, you just know it's a really, really big one because he doesn't waste any energy at all. If you look at it from an energy consumption standpoint with moving through the woods, some of them won't even jump over a fallen tree that's only 2 feet off the ground. They walk around it. They avoid jumping at all. They will if they have to, but they avoid jumping. they also are a master of knowing the terrain that they've been through. They've been through there so much that they already know the obstacles that they might come into, so they avoid them before they even get to them. And that'll tell you that that deer has been through that area a long time. A really good case in point, I was following one down a trail, a quad trail, which, believe it or not, once it gets dark, these big bucks will walk right down human trails, quad trails, roads, because it's the easiest traveling, and they know they're safe at night, so they'll go on the easiest path. I'm walking along, following him, and all of a sudden he cut into the woods, and I'm thinking, why did he go off the road here? I could still had a quarter mile of trail to walk on nice. Why would he leave this nice trail to go? Well, so I get up there just a little ways further, and I realize there's a puddle there, and the way the water was formulated and everything, it was the only way around it without having to go through that water would have been to dip off on the side a ways back, and he could have stayed dry by dipping off a ways back like he did. So that tells you that buck has been through there so many times already that he knew about the water before he got to it, and he knew which way to go to get around it. He knew the easiest path through that area. So when you start following a really good buck, you'll see that. You'll see that another thing you can ascertain is how big of a rack they got. It might be a really, really big track, but he might be a small buck yet. And in the Northwoods, a 3-year-old really doesn't have much for a rack yet. But he'll come to a tree, and there'll be 2 trees on the path, and they'll be 18 inches wide, and he'll walk right in between it. And it's like, okay, well, he probably don't have much of a rack then. Right. But if he's a good one, he'll walk around.
Right. The one example that you gave that really made a lot of sense to me was like a overhanging branch that should have been caught in a buck's tines if it had decent headgear, and should have knocked the snow off, and it never did. And that to me was like a really like an aha moment, was like looking for those little disturbances that can help kind of give you more intel than just just the track itself.
Well, a lot of times when you have the right snow conditions, and you don't always have the right snow conditions, but when you have the right snow conditions where the snow is hanging on the branches pretty good, but will still fall off, you'll know how wide he is, you'll know how high his tines are, you'll know everything about that buck before you even shoot him, because you'll see the disturbances, how much snow he knocks off of what limbs when he went through there. You can picture in your mind how wide that rack was when he went through there, that, well, look at that. That snow wasn't even disturbed up there, so he couldn't have been really big.
Right.
And sometimes if rack size is the most important consideration for you, you might pull off of one of those because of that. You might say, well, I just don't want to waste my time on this one because he looks like a pretty good, big body deer and everything, but he just doesn't seem to have the rack I'm looking for, so I'm going to let this one go.
Right. Now, do you, in terms of like how they're moving, straight lines, side to side, whatever the case is, do you find that they change anything about how they move, or do their tracks become a little bit different, or the spacing or anything become different as they get closer to bedding? I guess I'm asking, like, from a tracks perspective, do they act different as they get closer to bedding versus when they're not around their bedding?
I'll tell you what, I've tried to guess a million times that they're going to go down, and then I would go into creep mode, and I would just waste an awful lot of time. Sometimes they'll start meandering for reasons that I don't know, I don't understand. Sometimes they'll break off and they go into heavier cover, and I'll start really going to creep mode and wait, thinking I'm right on them, I'm going to jump them here. There's really, other trackers out east have talked in the mountainous countries. They talk about them going uphill, and then they'll feed, and then they'll bed, and then maybe their patterns are more, strict that way. Maybe they do that a lot. I'm more of a flatlander, so I quit guessing now, because he's probably 4 miles ahead of me yet. I can't slow down, because if I slow down, I'm never going to catch him. Right. And I've been wrong many more times than I'm ever right. So one indication that he's going to lay down, there's one. If he stops and really feeds up, which is very rare, if he stops and really starts pawing the ground hard and really feeding and really, really ripping up an area and feeding, he's going to go down. But boy, good luck finding that. I mean, that's rare. 1 out of 100 that where he'll really. I don't know how these deer survive. They don't eat. They never eat during the rut. Honest to God, you follow these deer for miles and miles and miles, and they stop and they eat a little old man's beard. They'll chew on a mushroom on the side of a tree. They'll paw on the ground and eat a little bit of fern or something, but not enough, for it would be like you and me going a whole day and eating a handful of peanuts.
Right.
And they do this all day long, every day. And it's like, I don't know how they survive. Well, I know how they survive. They lose a huge amount of their body weight.
Yeah.
They in some cases literally run themselves to death.
Yeah, I mean, it's something like they'll lose maybe, don't quote me on the percentage, but I think if I'm not mistaken, it's something like 30% roughly of their body weight, of their body mass they'll lose.
They can lose that, and they also, I don't know because I'm not a biologist, but I've heard if they lose a certain percentage, they won't even make the winter.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with that. And I imagine it's probably even more so whenever you get further up, in the neck of the woods where you live.
That 8-pointer I was telling you about that's mounted on the wall right next to me now, that's a 140 class. And it was one of the very few deer that I didn't get a chance to get on a scale. His track told me he was light, but his track was big. Mm-hmm. But he wasn't making heavy tracks. He was making big tracks, but not heavy tracks. And I read that into there, but I kind of discounted it until I shot the deer, walked up to him. I rubbed my hand down his back. He was hollow. Yep. This deer was maybe, and I don't know for sure because I never got him on a scale. My guess is he went 160 to 165. That's all he weighed.
Wow.
And I know he had the frame of a 200-pound deer.
Right. Yeah.
And this was late rut. It was December 11th when I shot that deer. So it was getting awful late, and he was already actually slowing down from the rut, and he was actually doing a lot more feeding.
Right.
So he was slowing down, and he was trying to put some of that body weight back on. But man, and when you look at the pictures of him, he still looks like a really big deer because frame-wise, he was a really big deer. But when you put your hands on him, and you can see just how much muscle mass he lost, it was amazing. I thought to myself, I'm not sure that he would have actually made it.
Right. Yeah.
He was so run down.
So I want to circle back to like when I asked you just a little bit about when you don't have snow, but what's your approach when you're tracking on bare ground? I mean, because that's got to be kind of a game changer, going from snow to tracking on bare ground. I'm sure you're having to look for a lot of different types of things whenever it comes to bare ground tracking. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't.
No.
Let me put it to you this way. I know that during the rut, they're probably going to go 4, 5, 6, 7 miles. Who knows, maybe 12 miles. I can't keep with them that long on bare ground. And if I tried, and there's times when you get into some leaves, they're turning up and you can follow them for distances. But you can't go fast enough,
right,
to ever catch them. There's no way in a day's time. If you would get really lucky and he would happen to be very close to you, you can follow. If you track enough, you can see where they're disturbing the ground, especially in softer areas, or good leaves. If they get turned over a little bit, they're a heavy animal. They will disturb those leaves enough, and you can see fresh disturbed leaves. But quite honestly, it's extremely, extremely low percentage. I would more or less in those kind of situations, I'd go back to historical places where I know that a big buck uses those areas and either still hunt or call or just take up a stand somewhere, because your percentages are probably better. I'm not saying that you can't track on bare ground or that you couldn't catch one, but luck would have to be in your favor. You would have to pick the track at the right time and have him only like a half a mile away or something, and then maybe you would, you'd be able to catch up with them.
Right. No, that totally makes sense. I mean, you're really kind of fighting with one hand tied behind your back at that point, right?
Well, here's another thing too. I've heard this a lot, and I'm never going to call anybody a liar or doubt them or anything, but. And I'm not an athlete, and I'm 57 years old, so I'm not young. But I can move through the woods. Mm-hmm. But what I found is when you hear somebody going much further than the distances I go, I wonder about it, because it would take absolute, pristine, perfect conditions where there's like one deer only in that whole country, and you have 3 inches of perfect snow, and you can jog along behind that track.
Mm-hmm.
I can't go fast enough, even in really good conditions, to get much more than 6 miles on in a day.
Right.
Because they always run into other tracks, and then they start circling around and milling around there, looking to see if that doe is in heat, or they always like to go and check if there was a doe bedded. They'll always go to the bed and smell it. Oh, every time. They'll cut off and they'll go and they'll smell that bed, and then they mix up with the doe tracks, and you got to figure it out. And there might have been a doe and 2 fawns, and they made a bunch of tracks because they were feeding, and you got to figure out which one is his. You have to make a couple big circles in the area, find out where he came out of there, and then you're on your way again. Well, you can only cover so much ground at so much speed. And according to my GPS, a good fast track for me is a little bit over 1.5 miles an hour.
Right.
And when you factor in, you have to have time to get back. I don't walk out in the dark. Whenever I possibly can avoid doing that, I usually try to cut out, giving myself enough time to get out during the light of day. I don't want to poke my eyes out, and I don't want to sleep in the woods at night.
Right.
And I'm usually an awful long way from the vehicle. And so I'll pull off maybe 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There's times when I push that issue hard.
Mm-hmm.
If I check my GPS and I know I'm quarter mile from a road, I'll push it right till dark. Then I can just skip to the road and I can walk out,
Right.
And then you got to factor in, I got to find a track in the morning. I might not get on that track until 10 o'clock. So how much time do I really have to take that track? So it's hard to put any much more miles in that, and you can't only go so fast.
Right.
So when I hear people, track the deer 12 miles, I'm not going to say they didn't.
Right.
I'm just going to say, wow, that's incredible if they did.
Right.
They're, it must have had pristine, perfect, conditions to do that, and I know I won't even go 12 miles anymore. Not at my age. I ain't got that in the tank anymore. Not in the woods. Maybe on the flat I could, but not in the woods.
Right.
If I change to 12, I still got to get out.
Yeah, 12 miles is a fur piece, man. It's nothing to sneeze at. I think the most I ever did in a day in the timber. Now this was out west hunting elk. I did 15 miles in one day.
Wow, that's incredible.
And that was moving. Like it was a 4-mile hike in just to get into where we wanted to be, to then hike to where we wanted to hunt. And so that was a rough day. But that was the most I'd ever done. Like that trip, that was every other day outside of that, we were doing about 9. And some of that is like you're maybe walking like an access road for a little ways, and in the morning when you're trying to get to where you're going to glass, I mean, you're not looking at anything. It's dark. You're just moving as fast as you can move, to get to your spot or whatever. And so,
right.
And
you're not trying to follow a track or not. You're just putting on miles.
No, you're just putting on miles, you know what I mean? And then, so you might do 4 or 5 pretty quick, and then the next 5 or 6 might be pretty slow, you know what I mean? And then you might have to come back 4 miles, and those miles are fast too. You know what I mean? So
right.
It's a little bit different, but man, I want to be sensitive to your time. Let you get on with your evening here. I appreciate you coming on and talking tracks with me. I've been looking forward to this conversation. We'll have to have you back on again. Maybe this fall, see how things are going with you. I'll certainly hit you up if I have any tracking questions. But before I let you go, if you wouldn't mind, let folks out there listening know where they can maybe find out more about you, learn about you, find your videos and stuff like that.
Sure. I'm on YouTube, and just type in Misty River Trackers and you'll find me. I try to put everything I do over there, even like live feeds and stuff that I do on Facebook. During season, I try to do a lot of little tutorials if I have reception, and I'll actually go live and do maybe a 5-minute tutorial. And I try to get all that stuff over on YouTube, kind of bring it all over there under Misty River Trackers, so you can find me there. I have a web page as well. I got it's www.mistyrivertrackers.com. That's kind of set up more for people to get to see me and to kind of bring some of the sources together as well. And there's going to be a store on there. It's set up right now, but right now I'm not worried about trying to make money. I'm worried about just trying to get the information out there to people and whatever. And eventually I'll get T-shirts and hats, and that's where I want people to. I do a tracking school as well. Then I'll use that as my platform for for the pay over there. But there's not going to be a lot of activity at that site. The big place to find me and to see where the daily activity is going to be on Facebook, and you got to go to the Facebook group called Misty River Trackers Base Camp. That's where you're going to find the daily activity or whatever. A lot of the things I do when I'm out and about, and when I got some content to share, when I have something funny to say, or whatever the case. In the off season, it's going to slow down quite a bit. My business, my real business, takes precedence, and so things are going to slow down quite a bit. I've been doing a lot of tracking. I've been trying to get a lot of tracking videos out there too. Scouting. I've been doing a lot of scouting, and I've been trying to do a lot of scouting videos and getting those out there. If you're, let's say, intermediate or beginner or whatever, you probably can get a lot from those scouting videos. I got a camera on my shoulder, and I just go along and talk it through what I'm seeing and whatever.
Awesome. Well, everyone out there listening, be sure to give Todd a follow. Check out his Facebook page. Check out his YouTube channel. Todd, thanks for coming on, buddy. I appreciate you.
No problem.
All right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank all of you for listening. And if you haven't yet, please head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast. And hell, while you're at it, head over to YouTube and subscribe to the channel there as well. I'd be super appreciative if you do those couple things for me. And before I shut this thing down, I need to give a big shout out to our partners who continue to help us make this podcast possible. Tethered, Exodus Outdoor Gear, Skull Brew Coffee Company, and Gumleaf USA Boots. And until next time, we'll see y'all.